Hi again then guys, and welcome to another look back to the relatively recent past of the first Forza Horizon game, and this has always been one of those cars for me that I couldn't quite understand why it never progressed past this game. Now it's the kind of car which, due to its, again, relatively recent age, could always return, or maybe even an updated newer version of it, but it does seem very strange to have certain cars like this one, or my favourite car in Horizon 1, the Maserati MC12 Corsa, to only feature in that game. It seems like such a waste. I mean, it's cool that they're in the game, or the Toyota FJ Cruiser as well as another perfect example, but it's such a waste really to have a car that's so good, which all three of those are, and yet never have them again. Now, in the case of the Maserati, it's a very personal thing for me. Of course, many of you know, especially if you watch my top 50 favourite vehicles playlist, that I have a lot of love for the Maserati MC12, so it's a very personal choice for me, even though I will readily admit that it's not the best of cars in the game. It can be beaten by, for instance, the Ferrari F50 GT, as an example. However, in the case of the Toyota FJ Cruiser and this car, the Mercedes S65 AMG, these are slightly different, because although I like them both, especially the Toyota actually, I have a lot of love for the FJ Cruiser, they are both cars which, regardless of if you like them or not, they are very, very useful. The Toyota in particular, as I mentioned in its review, in the lower classes, it's got a great amount of acceleration, great top speed, the handling is naturally very good, it's relatively compact compared to some of the other SUVs like Hummers, especially in terms of width. This one, on the other hand, well, this Mercedes is really good for basically anything between A and S. Any higher than that, and of course you're starting to get into supercar territory or track day territory, and it's going to struggle. It's a big, heavy limo, but in the A class, in the S class, you've got such a huge amount of power and torque working for you, and an excellent top speed on this car, that it's kind of like the Mercedes equivalent, at least as far as gaming goes, of what the BMW M5 often represents. Something like the E60 with the V10 engine. It's, yes, big and heavy compared to, say, a sports car, but it's got such a huge amount of straight line speed and good enough handling to still compete. Likewise with this Mercedes, it's the exact same scenario. Now, in its stock form, you've got a 6-litre V12 engine, it's a beast of an engine, and it's a heavy car, so of course it needs a big beefy engine to get that kind of performance out of it. It weighs 2.3 metric tons, 2,275 kilos, which is a lot, but at the same time, to put it into perspective, that's still less than a Bentley Continental GT, which is only a two-door car anyway. So it's actually not that bad when you think of it that way, considering this is a full-on four-door luxury limo. It really does show how much is packed into the Bentley CGT. Now, as far as the spec across the board, power is huge, torque is even more huge, which is not surprising at all for a Mercedes AMG. That's a very trademark thing for them, almost a very American approach, kind of like German muscle cars. And of course, many Germans do have a lot of love for American cars. I myself do. I'm not German, of course, but people do appreciate the kind of torque delivery, the big beefy power that American cars are known for, and AMGs are very much so the German equivalent of that. Now, in the case of the S65, you're running basically supercar power, 621 horsepower before you've even done anything to it, and an even more impressive 738 pound-feet of torque. So yes, it weighs 2.3 tons, but it's not exactly something to worry about. It's got way more power than something like the Bentley Continental, but it's also lighter, so that bodes pretty well. However, one of the potential disadvantages is, unlike the Bentley, it is not all-wheel drive. It is, of course, a rear-wheel drive car. So that could be quite adverse when you've got that much torque going through the back end of a car with a very long wheelbase. That could make it quite prone to being tail happy and drift happy, which is fun, of course, but not necessarily the best for cornering, the best for winning races, essentially. And to some degree, yeah, that's true, but the more common problem that you'll run into when you try to race the S65, and it's not an insurmountable problem, it's just something that you need to be aware of, is that it's very heavy through corners. It's actually not as tail happy as you might think. When you tune it up more and drop the weight, then that becomes more of an issue, but not really, not as much as you might think. It's much more so the heaviness which really comes into play, because in Horizon 1 you have a lot more really tight corners, and because you cannot go off track anywhere near as much as in the second and especially third game, where you can just go through pretty much any barrier and drive overland through mud, water, whatever, you can't do that in the first game. There are certain areas of the map where you can, but most of it is fenced off. So if you slam into a wall with an S65, it's going to take you longer to get that momentum and that performance up again than it would with, say, like a Lotus, for instance, in the same category of A. Now, speaking of that category, it is A556 PI. So you've actually got quite a lot of legroom, and that brings me to, in particular, where I would recommend strongly using this car. And that is in particular on two circuit layouts. The Motorway Dash, which I can't remember exactly what it's called, but it's basically the longest drag race in the game, or Goliath. Now for both of those tracks, it's about maintaining, at least for a majority of the circuit, a really high average speed, and especially a really good top speed on the motorway sections. That is what this car is great for. It's really smooth, it's really grounded. Its handling at those speeds of over 200 miles per hour is not twitchy in the slightest. It feels very secure, very safe. Just like driving a big BMW or a Bentley, it's what you'd expect it to be. It's more so the low speed corners where the car just doesn't have any advantage. It's too big, it's too heavy, the torque doesn't really feel like it's being delivered quickly enough to really benefit you. And that's why, of course, it can be pretty easily outmatched by a number of other cars, even with far less power if you do try to take it around technical circuits. There are certain areas on the map, such as up in the mountains, you don't stand a chance. The corners are way too tight, you don't have anywhere near enough of a straight section to use the main advantages of the car, so this really is a tool for certain occasions. And that does differentiate it a bit from the FJ Cruiser, because the Toyota is just really good across the board for low classes, because in the low classes you're not going anywhere near as fast anyway, so handling, cornering, you have more time to react, whereas up in A and S and above you have to make split-second decisions, hairpins, 90-degree turns, that kind of thing. And with this car you just can't, because by the time you've decided to make an emergency manoeuvre, the car then takes another second or so to actually start turning. Kind of like driving a big old-school American car, just with slightly stiffer suspension. And so ultimately I would say that the S65, despite being a 215 grand car, which is a fair amount but not surprising for what it is, it's the kind of weapon that is extremely useful for particular classes on particular events. I would always keep a couple of these in my garage on Horizon 1. I'd have one built up for A-Class, one built up for S-Class, because those are the two prime zones where you can get the most out of this car. So if you bear that in mind, it can be a very formidable tool to use. Just keep it within its wheelhouse and you'll be okay. But that's it for this pick overall. Of course, I'll see you guys next time, and for now, as always, thanks for watching.